This video is about developing assessment rubrics. We'll be looking at why assessment rubrics are really important, the different components of them, and an example rubric. So why are rubrics important? Some of the key issues that are reported about assessment in higher education will point us to the reason why rubrics are important. From the student's perspective, there are certain things about assessment that are often seen as challenging. So some of the issues for students are the lack of consistency in standards, lack of clarity about assessment expectations, the lack of variety in assessment types, not receiving enough support, and feedback not being helpful. And also from staff, there's perceived barriers to good assessment practices, and these are the lack of time to talk with the colleagues about assessment, lack of time regarding the marking and providing feedback for students, and also low levels of confidence of the markers in, am I marking this correctly, and is this, how much is this particular aspect of the assessment piece worth? So when we have a really well-designed assessment rubric, it can actually alleviate some of these issues or concerns, because a well-designed assessment rubric can communicate consistency in the standards of the assessment task, and it can actually provide clarity regarding the expectations of the task. And lastly, it can actually inform approaches to student learning. So the consistency has a lot to do with guiding individual markers. It aids discussion between markers when they're moderating, and it also helps students and teachers to talk about the assessment task before, during and after. Another thing is clarity. So it also makes explicit to the teaching team and the students what's actually being assessed and to what standard. And lastly, the informing of student learning. So really, the rubric can help to identify what parts of the task or what parts of the assessment is actually being valued and actually will help the students' learning. So what are the components of an assessment rubric? Really, it's a relevant and coherent set of criteria and standards. And this is all to do with being able to identify a student's performance. So whether the students are marking their own work, so it's a self-assessed piece of work, or whether there is a marker for this particular piece of work, whether it be a peer or a teacher, then the criteria and standards have been made explicit. When we're looking at well-designed rubrics, they are very descriptive. So they've got criteria and well-written descriptors for the standards. So here's an example of a rubric. There's criteria you can see on the left there, which is internet use, and then the standards relate to this. So we've got 4 standards here, and you can see that for each one of the standards, it is the same criteria that is linked right the way through. We just have different standards of this particular aspect that we're looking for across this particular criteria. So for example, there we can see successfully users, usually able to use, occasionally able to use, and needs assistance for use. So this is the kind of thing that we're looking for. The criteria themselves are the categories or the dimensions that the marker will be using to judge the student work. And there's always a link between the criteria, the task, and the learning outcomes. So for example, you can see here the learning outcomes that we've given in the table are to be able to articulate how conceptions of teaching align to your teaching practice in a teaching philosophy statement. The task is then to develop a teaching philosophy statement, and the criteria for marking them would be the conceptions of teaching and alignment between the beliefs and teaching practice. So there's a link between the learning outcomes, the task, and the criteria for marking. When we're looking at standards, they are the actual level of performance which might be achieved by the students against each criterion. So we might have things, for example, that specify, yes, very good, good, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, very unsatisfactory, or it could be novice, competent, proficient. So they're levels of how well the students are performing that particular criterion. So when you go about developing assessment rubrics, you really use the criteria to specify exactly what's being assessed. You limit that criteria to those that are the most important things. Don't have 15 elements that you're marking. What are the most important things that you're identifying in this task? Use positive descriptions of quality and quantity rather than negative. So for example, describe what you expect to see rather than what's missing. Once you get down to the last layers of the standards, you can actually identify through that these are the things that may be missing at this particular standard. And lastly, be consistent in the descriptors across the standards. So for example, make sure that you are focusing on quantity, clarity, details, that each one of those is then listed as the expectations for every standard. So for our example here, internet use, you can see that there have been used, or what has been used here, are positive descriptors, and we've also got consistency across the standards. So we're not looking at one thing in one standard and another thing in another. There's the same criterion that's used right the way through, and there are just different standards of that criteria. So within this video, we've looked at why rubrics are important, the different elements of a particular rubric, and also provided some examples of assessment rubrics.